Hello, Year 7, and welcome to today's lesson. Before we begin, just please be aware you don't need to photograph your work and upload it. Just make sure that it's written in your book. And the reason for this is because obviously today and tomorrow the lessons are going to be recorded, but you are going to be back in school on Wednesday, and teachers are in school today and tomorrow, and so I basically won't have time to look at your work, so there's no point in you uploading it. Please make sure you do it, but do please make sure that you don't worry too much about uploading it. So to start off with, a knowledge retrieval task. Today's lesson is focused on the Kraken. It's a knowledge, it's a consolidation week lesson, so we're going to review some parts of the Kraken. The first thing I'd like you to do is I'd like you to reread the poem, and then I'd like you to answer the following questions. So you can see the poem on your screen. I'd like you to reread the poem, and then I'd like you to answer the following questions. Where does the Kraken live? What does he do? How do we know that this place is dark? How long has he been there? What does he eat? When will he rise? 6 questions on the poem. Read the poem, answer the questions. Should take you about 5 minutes. When you've done that, move on to the next slide. Right, so these are the answers. I've highlighted them in different colours. Number 1, where does the Kraken live? Well, it lives at the bottom of the sea, and that is below the thunders of the upper deep, far, far beneath in the abysmal sea. So he lives at the very bottom of the sea. What does he do? He sleeps. The Kraken sleepeth, his ancient, dreamless, uninvaded sleep. And all the way through the poem, the Kraken sleeps, and he eats, but mainly he sleeps. How do we know this place is dark? We know it's dark because faintest sunlights flee from it, and the light is sickly. And remember, we talked about how that meant that the light was very faint. The idea is that the Kraken scared the light off, although actually at the bottom of the sea, it is very dark. How long has he been there? There hath he lain for ages, and there are words throughout that suggest it's old, ancient, millennial, but there hath he learned for ages, and an age is a long time. There hath he lain for ages. What does he eat? He eats huge sea worms, battening upon huge sea worms. And these are the things that we think he eats. He grabs them with his tentacles and eats them. When will he rise? He will rise on Judgment Day, when the latter fire shall heat the deep. Remember, in Christian mythology, some believe that the end of the world will be Judgment Day, and then things will go pretty badly, and there will be a lot of fire. And in Tennyson's poem, that is when the Kraken will rise. Tick the ones you got right and correct the ones that you didn't, and then we'll move on. Obviously, one of the main things we need to think about are some of the words that Tennyson uses. And so what I'd like to do first of all is I'd like to look at these 4 words in the poem. These are words that you probably haven't come across before. And these are the words abysmal, millennial, grot, and polypi. And I want you to write down what you think those words mean. So what does the word abysmal mean? What does millennial mean? Remember, the sponges are described as millennial sponges. What is a grot? And what are polypi? So spend a few minutes writing the answers to those questions. And then when you've done that, I want you to look at the following phrases. And I want you to write down what you think they mean. Thunders of the upper deep, faintest sunlights flee, which should be easy because we mentioned it in the knowledge retrieval, as indeed we did the sickly light, many a wondrous grot and cell, and the latter fire. Again, that one should be fairly straightforward. So write down the answers to those, and then when you're ready, move on and we'll talk through them. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about the rhyme scheme. Okay, so abysmal. Now remember, abysmal can have two meanings. Abysmal can mean something really terrible, something really bad, but it can also mean to do with an abyss, which is a very, very deep hole. And Tennyson is using both meanings here. He's using abysmal in terms of something really terrifying, like the sea, but he's also using it to emphasize how deep down the Kraken is at the bottom of an abyss. So abysmal has two possible meanings, both of which fit this poem. Millennial. Millennial basically comes from the word millennium, which means 1,000 years. So sponges of millennial growth and height are basically sponges which seem to have been growing for thousands of years and are therefore huge and unnatural. And this emphasizes the slightly alien world of the Kraken. Something slightly unusual where things grow to be very big. And of course, the Kraken is a giant sea monster. Um, grot. Grot is not, as you might think, slang for something which is grotty and unpleasant. It's actually short for grotto. And a grotto is like a kind of sea cave, and it has connotations of something quite mysterious and unusual. Um, the word here is trying to describe the landscape of the Kraken's world and the depths of the sea. Polypi. So polypi basically comes from the word poly, which means many, and pi, which I think is linked to the word for feet or limbs, and effectively a polypi are creatures that have many limbs and tentacles. So it's describing more creatures that live down at the bottom of the sea, like in a squid or octopus, creatures that have all these huge limbs. So that's what polypi are. So check your meanings and tick the ones you got right and correct the ones that you didn't. The phrases, well, we covered most of these in the knowledge retrieval actually, so you should be able to get these. The thunders of the upper deep. The upper deep is the top of the sea. It's a weird phrase, isn't it? Because we're sort of looking at it from down below, and the thunders of the upper deep describes a really stormy sea. The surface of the sea is really stormy, and actually, when we get down below, it becomes very calm. So it's a weird idea that the sea monster is living in the calm part of the sea. The top of the sea is really kind of violent and choppy and thunderous. The thunders of the upper deep is the surface of the sea. Faintest sunlights flee, and that is basically emphasizing that it is dark down there. And Tennyson's idea is that the Kraken is so frightening that even the light runs away from him. And in fact, it's a reference to the actual physical fact that the deeper you get, the darker it gets because the light can't get through can't refract through the water. And similarly, the sickly light emphasizes how dark it is, and the word sickly again gives some qualities of something menacing and something perhaps slightly frightening and unpleasant. And the light, the idea is the light down there would be like kind of green and very sort of uh, difficult to see. Many a wondrous grot and secret cell. Well, we talked just about the meaning of grot, that's short for grotto, and a cell is effectively also a small cave. So this idea, the wondrous grot and secret cell, and this is where the polypi live. And it's creating the landscape of the Kraken's world, which is not a frightening place. It's a mysterious and wonderful place of hidden caves and strange creatures. Got Tennyson here trying to give us a sense of the world that the Kraken lives in. And remember, it sleeps the whole time. It doesn't actually experience this world. The latter fire. Now, again, the latter fire, as I mentioned, is a very specific reference, and it's a reference to what is known as Judgment Day. And the idea is that humanity will be judged by Christ and by God, and it will be the time when hell rises and all sorts of stuff. And if you're genuinely interested, there's one of the books of the Bible called The Revelation of St. John the Divine, and he talks about Judgment Day. So we get a lot of ideas about the apocalypse, like the four horsemen, although I don't think he numbers them, and the Antichrist, although I don't know if the Antichrist is mentioned, and the idea of the number of the beast, which actually isn't 666, and so on and so forth. Tennyson here is referring to the idea of the end of the world, and that because the fires of hell will heat the sea, the Kraken will rise, and then he'll die. So he's got a bit of a futile life, the poor old Kraken. That's what the latter fire is. It's Judgment Day. So again, check your answers, and then when you're ready, I just want to talk to you a little bit about the rhyme scheme, because you might remember that the poem has quite an interesting rhyme scheme, and that although it's a sort of semi-regular rhyme scheme. So in the first four lines, it's effectively A B A B. So we've got deep and sleep, and then see and flee. And then when we get to the next four lines, we get into a kind of a slightly different rhyme scheme, and we go C D D C. So we get swell and sell, but then height and light. So you'll notice here that the rhyme scheme has changed slightly. In these first four lines, what we've got is these, trying to circle it here. You think we're going into a fairly straightforward rhyme scheme. Beneath the thunders of the upper deep, far, far beneath in the abysmal sea, his ancient dreamless unveiled sleep, the Kraken sleepeth, fate is sunlight's flee. And we think, okay, well that's the rhyme scheme, and suddenly Tennyson changes it in the next four lines. So we go, about his shadowy sides, above him swell huge sponges of millennial growth and height, and far away into the sickly light, for many a wondrous grot and secret cell. So he's actually changed the rhyme scheme. Now, there's a couple of reasons why he might have done that. Partly it's to do with the poem being a bit like a sonnet, which is a form of love poetry, and a sonnet had a fairly strict approach to rhyme schemes, which meant that you did stuff like that. Partly, I think, it's to demonstrate the power of the Kraken. And I think it's almost like the Kraken is so powerful and so strong, it's deforming the poem. It's causing the rhyme scheme to break. Because then something really interesting happens with the rhyme scheme, and we get a really complicated change. So we go polypi, lie, die, green, seen, and then sleep, deep again. So in this case, what we've got is we've got effectively E, F, G, G, E, F. So green line rhymes with seen. Let me see if I can draw an arrow here. So green lines with seen, lie with die, and then sleep and deep. So, and sleep and deep are both repeated from earlier in the poem. So we've got a kind of, the rhyme scheme is changing again. So winnow, a numbered and enormous polypi, winnow with giant arms, the slumbering green, there hath he lain, and for ages will lie, battening upon huge sea worms in his sleep. Oh, I forgot there's the polypi rhymes with die as well. Um, so I think the idea here is that Tennyson is suggesting that the Kraken is so powerful that it actually can deform the rhyme scheme of the poem. It was breaking out of the poem and causing the poem's rhyme scheme to change. However, you could also argue that the fact that Tennyson has used a very sort of almost regular rhyme scheme in places suggests that the Kraken is trapped under the sea as well, and it's trapped in, you know. So if you think about the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner and by the sea, in both of those poems, the rhyme scheme is a lot more broken and doesn't follow the same sort of rules as Tennyson is following here. So he is still following some rules. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. What we're going to do now is we're going to have a think about a little bit of language analysis. Now, we spent a lot of time doing this when we looked at the poem in the first instance, and we're not going to have time to go through the whole poem again. Ideally, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to read back over your notes that you made when you did the poem originally. So this is just as a kind of reminder of what we did. So we're going to start with these first two lines. Below the thunders of the upper deep, far, far beneath the abysmal sea. Now, the first thing to think about, what are the connotations of the word thunders? What tone does this set for the rest of the poem? So I'd like you to note down your thoughts on that. So pause this presentation, note down your thoughts, and then I'll talk you through it. Right, well, obviously, connotations of thunders. Thunder is loud. It's sound. It kind of has connotations of danger and threat, and it's an example of pathetic fallacy. It's using the environmental conditions to set the tone for the poem. It makes us think that the poem is going to be about something violent and dangerous, like thunder. Of course, we know, having read the poem, that it isn't. That Tennyson sets up this idea, but it doesn't actually go with it, and that it is a misdirection. So the word thunders suggests that the poem is going to be about something violent and dangerous, but actually it isn't. What language technique is used to suggest the Kraken's emotions? So that's not a very good question, actually. It should be what language technique is used to suggest the mood of the poem. And I've kind of given you that because obviously it's pathetic fallacy. So it's not a wonderfully well-written question, but the language technique that is used is pathetic fallacy, the thunders of the upper deep. Right, far, far beneath the abysmal sea. So, what are the connotations of the word abysmal? If you've been paying attention, you should know this because we've mentioned the word several times already today. So, what are the connotations of the word abysmal? What does it suggest about the sea? Well, that should be fairly obvious. So, pause the presentation, make a note, and then when you're ready, I'll talk you through it. Right, so abysmal obviously has connotations of something terrible, but also something deep. And this suggests that the sea is terrifying, but also very deep, the abysmal sea. It's emphasizing its power, its terror, its depth. How might this make the reader feel about the Kraken? Well, have a think about that. Note down your thoughts, pause the presentation, and I'll talk you through it. Chances are it'll link to thunders and make the reader think that the Kraken itself is abysmal, that Kraken itself is something terrifying, frightening, awful, and also that it inhabits the deepest and most frightening parts of the sea. So I think the use of the word abysmal will emphasize for readers the terrifying nature of the Kraken. So that's how I'd like you to approach notes. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at three more key parts of the poem, and I'm going to get you to have a go at answering some questions about them. So I want you to think about these. His ancient, dreamless, uninvaded sleep. The Kraken sleepeth, faintest sunlights flee, and then once by man and angels to be seen, in roaring he shall rise and on the surface die. What you're going to do is you're going to analyze each of those three quotations. You're going to describe what you think they mean, what you think Tennyson was trying to do, what effects he was trying to create. And most importantly, I want you to answer this question. Is the Kraken something evil and destructive that we should fear, or is he an innocent victim? Do you think that the Kraken is evil and destructive? If so, why? Or is he an innocent victim? So what you're going to do is you're going to answer, write about these three quotations, explain what they mean, and then you're going to answer that question. And that'll take you to the end of the lesson. Now, if you want to, you can organize your page like this. You don't have to. You can write these in a straightforward way, but what you need to do is you need to leave yourself enough space to be able to analyze each of the quotations. And what I've got are a series of questions that I'm going to ask you to answer. And then I'd like to answer that big question before you finish. Right, so first quotation I'm going to ask you to analyze. This is going to take you about 5 minutes. His ancient, dreamless, uninvaded sleep. How does the word ancient suggest the Kraken's age? Have a think about the connotations of the word ancient. What does that suggest about the Kraken's age? Why might the word dreamless make the reader have more sympathy for the Kraken, his ancient dreamless sleep? Why might that make a reader feel sympathy for the Kraken? And thirdly, why might the word uninvaded suggest that the Kraken is alone? Why might the word uninvaded suggest the Kraken is alone? So write your answers to those questions, and then when you're ready, move on to the next line. So the next line is, the Kraken sleepeth, faintest sunlights flee. So what does the old-fashioned verb sleepeth, that means to sleep, suggest about the Kraken's age? What does sleepeth suggest? So why hasn't Tennyson used the word sleeps? Why has he used sleepeth? What does that suggest about the Kraken's age? How does the line show the lack of light and make things sound scary? So think about what he's describing here. Faintest sunlights flee. So how does that show the lack of light? And what particular word suggests things are scary? And again, how does the line emphasize that the Kraken is isolated and alone? So write down your answers to those questions, and then when you're ready, move on to the last quotation. And this is, then once by man and angels to be seen, in roaring he shall rise and on the surface die. So how might the reader respond to the Kraken's death? How might the reader feel about the Kraken? Think about the fact that he is seen once. What is the connotation of the word roaring? What does that suggest about the Kraken? In roaring he shall rise. So what does that suggest? And there's a little bit of alliteration there, isn't there? What are the connotations of roaring? What does that suggest about the Kraken? And how does this link to words used earlier in the poem? Think about the mood of most of the poem, um, and the tone of it, and think about the opening line of the poem: "Thunders of the upper deep, the abysmal sea." So how do these moments link to the earlier moments of the poem? And do you think that this shows a fair or an unfair death? Is it fair for the Kraken that he only gets to see the surface once and then die? Or is that right? Is that something that we should think is a fair thing to happen? That is the angels and man overcoming some sort of evil? So note down your answers to those questions. And then the final question I'd like to answer is this, and that is the Kraken something evil and destructive that we should fear, or is he an innocent victim of his situation? That is, what's your opinion? I'd like to write a couple of sentences giving me an answer to that question from your point of view, explaining why. So is the Kraken something evil, destructive? Is he actually an innocent victim? Why do you think that? And then when you've done that, remember you don't need to photograph your work. All you need to do is make sure it's finished, and I will speak to you again tomorrow. And that is it.